1 d4. It's a good move. It can't be faulted. So what are we going to do? Perhaps d5, c4, c6, the Slav defence. Bolster it. Block it all up. Perhaps we can get a draw. No, you're damn right we're not going to do that. We want to play the Benoni for thrills and spills. d4, knight f6, c4, c5, imbalancing the position. For some reason, when I hear the name Benoni, I always conjure up images of that Star Wars character, Obi-Wan Kenobi. His weapon against the forces of evil was a lightsaber. Let your weapon be the Benoni as you combat the Darth Vaders of the chessboard. Throughout the tape we'll be looking at White's main move, and certainly his best move, pawn up to d5. Just for a second though, I'd like to talk about any wimpy alternatives that White may have. One possibility is e3. This looks a bit funny because the bishop on c1 is locked inside of the pawn chain. A sensible continuation for black would be g6, knight to f3, bishop to g7, knight c3 and castles. What black can do in the near future is trade pawns on d4, c takes d4, e takes d4, and then play pawn straight up to d5. The likelihood is that White's going to end up with an isolated pawn here on d4, which is going to be attacked by the knight coming to c6, and of course extra pressure from the bishop here on g7. White really won't want to consider capturing on c5, d4 takes c5, because, well, black can always regain this pawn with pawn to e6 and bishop takes c5. Or, alternatively, knight a6 takes c5. Therefore, the only other move worthy of consideration is white knight coming out to f3 immediately. One idea I quite like for black then is just to take this pawn on d4, c takes d4, and after knight takes d4, play a quick pawn up to e5. This would appear to weaken the d5 square, but after knight b5 hoping to come into d6 is a very aggressive variation that black can play. Pawn up to d5, white pawn captures on d5, now not recapturing this pawn on d5 immediately by virtue of a check which will appear on c7, but rather bishop to c5, pawn up to e3 and castles. Instead of aiming to regain this pawn here on d5, black can seek to attack. He can force the knight back at some point and then advance the e-pawn in order to give the e5 square to the black knight, or perhaps to the queen. In conjunction with the bishop, if white castles kingside, he could be in all sorts of trouble here. The pawn on h2 would be an obvious target. I did feel it was important for me to mention this because a lot of players that do play the Benoni in fact opt to make a Nimzo-Indian move order. Confused? Well, let me explain. The problem is, after d5, e6, knight c3, e takes d5, c takes d5, and pawn to d6, which brings us into our typical Benoni position, white has the option to throw both of these pawns down the centre of the board. If instead black was to make it look as though he was going to play the Nimzo-Indian with pawn to e6, and white didn't choose to allow the pin with knight c3, bishop to b4, but instead played knight to f3, the other main alternative, then of course after pawn to c5, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, pawn to d6, you notice that white's committed the knight to f3 already, so the f2 pawn won't be playing an important part in the game, certainly not in the very early stages. Alright, the main line then. After d5, e6, knight c3, e takes d5, c takes d5, d6. A feature of the game is that black will be fianchettoing his bishop with g6 and bishop g7, and this bishop here on g7 will have a big impact. It directs towards white's queen side and can be compared with the dragon bishop, but not, I fancy, with the King's Indian bishop, which is so often blocked by a pawn on e5. I'll split the video into 7 distinct chunks. In the first section, instead of getting on with pawn to e4, I'm looking at lines whereby white maybe pressurises this d6 pawn with moves such as bishop to f4, knight to f3, knight to d2 and knight c4. The fianchetto variation comes next, where white fianchettos his bishop as well as black. This always leaves me slightly confused because I can see how this bishop on g7 is nice and open, but surely white's fianchettoing his bishop against his own pawn. Next up, we'll see white playing his knight to f3 in conjunction with pawn to e4. The problem with this is that this enables black at some point to use this bishop to pin the knight on f3. That leads us nicely up to the next section, in which white plays knight f3 to d2 first before committing the pawn to e4, thus sidestepping the pin of the knight on f3 to the queen on d1. A slight change comes up in the next chunk, when instead of playing the knight to f3, white opts for pawn up to e4, bishop d3 and knight g e2. This doesn't look particularly aggressive to me, and besides, black's going to continue in the normal manner, g6, bishop g7 and castles. This happens pretty much in every variation. We wrap things up nicely with the aggressive lines whereby white plays e4, g6 and then f4. First of all, we'll look at bishop g7, knight f3, the 4 pawns attack. Now, yep, I can count 2. In fact, there's only 3 pawns here. But as you'll see, it comes from a direct transposition of the King's Indian defence. Last but not least, we have the dangerous bishop b5 check, so-called flick knife attack, once considered the refutation of the modern Benoni, but recently it's certainly been blunted. Before I start looking at all those chunky chunks, I'd just like to show you a favourite game of mine. This was played in the 1996 British Championships, and effectively it clinched me the title. Playing white was one of England's top grandmasters, Matthew Sadler, an integral part of the English Olympiad team. He played knight f3, g6. Matthew adopted a slightly tricky move order. He played knight d2, bishop to g7, and knight to c4. After I castled, I was expecting him to pressurise this d6 pawn immediately with something like bishop to f4. This is the so-called knight's tour variation, and in fact, well, black can adequately defend this pawn on d6 with knight e8. Just a word about this. As a junior, I played this line with white because I thought this was a definite target, this d6 pawn. But since then, I've learnt there is a reason why white is not so eager to ignore his kingside development. That's coming up shortly. Instead, Matthew returned to the realms of the fianchetto variation with pawn to g3, and at this point I realised why he had manoeuvred the knight to c4. When we come on to that section of the video, you'll notice that black definitely tries to remove that knight on c4, and one popular way of doing so is by playing knight to d7 and then to e5. Doing that this time around, though, would leave this d6 pawn on prise. There's no doubt that the white knight is very well placed on c4, and black really needs to get rid of it. In this game, I chose another popular method and played pawn to b6. The idea is that at some juncture I want to play my bishop over to a6 in order to remove it. Matthew played a4, And here I like to think I went backwards in order to go forwards. I retreated my knight from f6 back to e8, so as you'll see I've got an awful lot of pieces lined up along the back rank. However, there's a reason behind this. I want to utilise my f-pawn. I want to thrust it forward to f5 in order to gain control of a key e4 square. Another point is that my d6 pawn is of course defended. Matthew continued naturally with bishop g2, and I played my knight to d7. He castled, and here it comes, bishop over to a6. Generally you'll find in the Benoni that as white does have a slight space advantage, exchanges will tend to favour black. Matthew wanted to preserve this knight, so he moved it over to a3. We can see now why he played his pawn up to a4 first, because he certainly wouldn't want this b pawn coming down the board to b5 and to b4. Well, I played the thrust that I wanted so much, pawn up to f5. Now, when playing this move, you'll notice that it does give away a rather big hole on e6. Now, one thing that you don't want to allow is a white knight to get there, but I was quite happy that these knights were over on the queen side and wouldn't be heading over there real quick. Matthew played bishop to d2, and now my d7 knight hopped into a very nice square here on e5. Queen c1 was white's choice here, the intention no doubt being to remove a lot of the danger that my bishop here on g7 poses to his queenside by trading the bishop off via h6. Indeed, that's what happened. I played knight f6 and Matthew played bishop to h6. I added support to this bishop on g7 by playing queen up to d7. Matthew's next move is slightly puzzling. He decided to remove any pieces from this diagonal and played rook up to a2. I traded the bishops on h6, bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, and then played my knight from f6 over to h5. My aim is to lock the white queen out of the game by playing pawn up to f4. This is a move that white himself would like to play, but of course in doing so he would be weakening the e3 square tremendously, and the white queen has got to be very careful not just to get trapped. Therefore, the queen made its way back to c1, but I played pawn up to f4 anyway. Admittedly, my knight here on h5 isn't going to anywhere too quickly, but on the other hand, my e5 knight is nicely cemented in there. It's not going to be pushed away. The a3 knight re-entered the game here. It moved up to b5, but well, it wasn't going anywhere fast, and so I just played h6, preparing a possible kingside attack. Matthew played b3, controlling the c4 square. A very flexible option now by me. I played rook f7, possibly preparing the doubling of the rooks along the f-file. Now this pawn on f4 is a real thorn in white's side. Not only is there the option to play pawn up to f3, but I could take on g3 at any moment. Matthew felt he wasn't going anywhere fast on the queen side, so in fact played the knight to e4, attacking d6, but of course now the knight on b5 is no longer protected. I chopped it off, bishop takes b5, a takes b5. Now, we have an interesting situation here on the queen side. Sure, my a7 pawn could easily become a victim of white's major pieces along the a file. However, white's got several weak pawns here. In particular, the b5 pawn is of course on prise, but for the time being at least, I have to keep my d6 pawn protected, and that's why I played the move rook a d8. The queen came up to c3, and now I removed the central knight of white's by retreating my knight back to f6. White traded knights on f6, knight takes f6 check, and The rook recaptured. Rook takes f6. So now we have a situation whereby my knight is very nicely placed on e5. And what does the white have in exchange for that? He has this bishop here, which of course is hemmed in by this pawn on d5. White doubled up rooks on my a7 pawn. Rook f a1. I captured on b5. Not too worried about my a7 pawn, because I feel that I'm going to get plenty of counterplay here over on the white king position. The e2 pawn, for example, will be vulnerable, and I've still got my f pawn ready to cause a bit of damage. In fact, white decided that now he had to do something about my knight on e5, and, well, g takes f4 came in. I recaptured, rook takes f4, and now with pawn up to e3, white's asking my rook, where do you want to go? Do you want to stay on the f-file? Well, that's a tempting possibility, of course, but in fact I chose to swing over to b4 now to attack the b3 pawn. I'm not giving up altogether on the white king, but obviously for the moment I have other targets. White achieved his aim, pawn up to f4, attacking the knight, but I have rook takes b3 to throw in first of all, because it's attacking the white queen, of course. The queen retreated to c2. Now, of course I was a little bit nervous. I don't want the white rooks to emerge on my 7th rank, and I don't want this white queen to come down here on g6, of course. But my knight came into d3, and I'm keeping the queen well out of the game. The rook did indeed take on a7 now. Pawn up to c4. Look at that, supporting both the rook on b3 and the knight on d3. White came rook c7 now, of course, very flexible, of course, because he's attacking the pawn on c4 and preparing to double his rooks on the 7th rank. But now, my next move was a very good one. The queen, which has done its job on the queen side, retreated to e8, now preparing to re-enter the game down here on e3. Then all of a sudden, the white king will be looking well ropey. After the game, Matthew said this was the move he missed, and of course it seems to be a very devastating move. White had to play pawn up to e4. Now, of course, we see plenty of dark squared holes on d4, e3, and the bishop on g2 is really blocked out. What's more is I was able to capture the pawn on f4, and really, in this position, probably a mistake, but you can see why white removed my pawn on c4. Now, effectively, he is losing by force. I have a little combination. Rook to c3. The point being, of course, that if white was to capture this rook, queen takes c3, I have knight e2 check, a nifty fork, winning the white queen. White gave it a last roll of the dice. Rook to g7 check. Of course, if I capture this rook, he will be able to take my rook with check. No, thank you. King h8. I'll take that rook when I'm well and ready. Queen went to b4. Of course, d4. It would also run into the check on e2. But now, knight e2 check anyway, protecting the rook, such that after the king moved, I could take the rook on g7. In fact, I chose to do so with my queen. Queen f8 check. King takes e2. Queen takes g7. And in fact, a bit humiliating here, white resigned whilst losing on time at the same time. Is now the exchange and a pawn down, and his king is all over the shop. Moving swiftly on to section 1, I would like to use the game Kalantarian against Horvath to highlight the dangers to white of ignoring his development. What happened in this game was that white played the move bishop to f4, pressurising this backward d6 pawn. Black continued with bishop g7, and white played an odd looking move, queen a4 check. There is reason behind this move though. What white wants to do is to force black to put something in the way of the check. I guess king f8 would be a playable move, but generally black's going to want to put something in the way. He did in fact put the bishop in the way, bishop d7, but the point is that after queen b3 he has two pawns on prise, the d6 pawn and the b7 pawn. Black now played the stunning pawn up to b5. White took this pawn. Knight takes b5. Bishop takes b5. Queen takes b5 check. And then interposed with the knight. Knight b d7. Now white took a second pawn. Bishop takes d6. Now if we stop here for a second, we might say, what on earth is black doing? He's lost two pawns, and what's more, he can't castle. Well, we'll soon see how the game turned around. Black played knight into e4, which unleashes this wicked bishop along the g7 to b2 diagonal. The other point, of course, is not only is the knight well placed for attacking purposes on e4, but also it's saying to this bishop, oi, get out of there. For the time being at least, white took advantage of the pin of the d7 knight and played bishop back to e5. Black castled, and white traded off pieces. Of course, if he can swap off all the pieces, he's simply going to be two pawns up in a king and pawn endgame. King takes g7. As we'll see, he's not going to make it that far. Black's next move could well be rook a to b8 to activate the rook along the half-open b file. White anticipated this and played queen a4, effectively saying to this knight, oi, get out of there. In fact, black shocked white by playing rook b8 anyway, leaving the knight to be taken. That's exactly what happened. Queen takes e4, but now a fierce counterattack emerged. Queen a5 check, the white knight blocked on d2, and then the black rook captured on b2. So black's a fair bit of material down here, but of course he has his rook on the 7th rank, and this knight on d2 is coming under extreme pressure. White played rook d1 to defend the knight on d2, and now another casual move. The f rook swung over, doubling up rooks on the b file. Now when I first saw this I thought, well yeah, he's got a lot of pressure, but is it really sound? I mean, for example, I thought, couldn't white just play queen to e3, protecting the knight, and then possibly intend to get the bishop developed later? Well, in fact, if we take a close look at that, he can't. Rook takes a2, pawn to g3, and now rook a1. And in fact, white's in all sorts of trouble. For example, bishop h3, rook takes d1 check, king takes d1, queen a1 check, king c2, and rook b2 check. White is in all sorts of trouble. Instead, white played e3, hoping to just develop his bishop on f1 and then get castled. No such luck. Crash. Rook takes d2. Rook takes d2. Rook b2. There's another one where that one came from. White must now defend the rook. There's only one piece that can do it. Queen d3, but not wanting to feel left out, the black knight enters the fray. Knight e5, queen e2, and knight c4. There's simply no way to defend that rook. There's no other available pieces. White resigned. What we will have learnt from bishop f4, but hopefully white won't have, is that he shouldn't really neglect his development in favour of going to win a hot pawn on d6 or b7. Appropriately then, we move on to section 2, the fianchetto variation. And to demonstrate this, I would like to use the game Plaskett Arkle from the Hastings Challengers in 1997. This is basically the starting position. We see here a typical feature is that white has an extra e-pawn, black of course having a half open file here for his rook, but on the other hand black has a great potential for queenside expansion over here. Jim Plaskett immediately played rook e8, and as we've seen before, a common plan, white set this knight in motion from f3, aiming for the c4 square. Jim played a6. Now, obviously he would like to play pawn up to b5, but there's not much chance of that happening because really white's going to play a4 anyhow. One key point to note though is the b5 square in itself is covered, so we won't see the move knight b5 at any stage. We do know though that white, when he gets his knight to c4, has an excellent square for it, and so black really needs to take steps to exchange it. Last time we saw the black bishop making its way to a6. This time the knight confronted it head on. Knight to e5. Now here we have a slight diversion. In this game, white simply traded off the knights on e5. Knight takes e5, rook takes e5, and then budged the rook from e5 by playing bishop f4. Before we look at this though, I'd like to look at another line. In a previous encounter, Keith Arkle played the subtle finesse queen to c2, but fell for some home preparation of mine and Grandmaster John M's. In this game, which is very amusing, John swung the rook from e5 over to h5. It looks a bit funny there, but in fact black is actually aiming for a kingside attack, something which Keith Arkle doesn't usually like happening to him. He played pawn to e4, and after knight g4, rather blatant, no doubt thought that black was achieving nothing. He just played h3, and the black knight came back to f6. Of course now, the h3 pawn is on prise. But white probably thought, well, what's happening? Black's getting very muddled up over there, and played pawn to g4, no doubt expecting the black rook to retreat to e5. That's not what happened. Instead, and still all part of home preparation, came bishop takes g4. White has to take it. H takes g4, and then knight takes g4. We can now see that in fact the white king isn't entirely safe. One idea is for this queen to swing over to h4, and yes, thank you very much, queen h2 mate. In addition to this, the black bishop, which is always so useful when pointing towards white's queenside, has options of coming to e5 or even d4, pressurising the f2 pawn. In fact, all these points came into play because white came up with bishop to f4, a natural enough move covering the h2 square. Black played queen to h4 anyhow, and as this bishop is undefended here on f4, and black may well be considering something like bishop to e5, white chose simply to drop the bishop back to g3. Then came a stunner. Queen takes g3, f takes g3, and bishop to d4 check. Well, not too many options. The white rook went to f2, but we see now that after bishop takes f2 check, played in the game and incredibly still part of home preparation, the white queen's lost anyhow. If the king moves to f1, the black knight can simply come into e3 check, forking the queen on c2 and the king f1. Therefore, white had to part company with his queen. Queen takes f2, knight takes f2, king takes f2. The dust has settled. Black has a rook and 2 pawns for 2 minor pieces. That's certainly not always a good material situation to be in, even though officially, of course, you're a point up. But the fact that this is such a bad bishop enabled John to go and win a long endgame. My main regret with that previous line is that John Evans had the good fortune to play that line instead of me. However, after knight takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop f4, on track with the Arkle-Plaskett game, rook e8, queen c2, Jim played queen to e7. However, to highlight a few extra points, I'd like to say that I had actually played Keith Arkle previously and instead played knight over to h5. Bishop retreated to d2 and I played pawn up to f5. Again, I'm not too worried now about the e6 square being weak, and I am quite pleased to be gaining control of the e4 square and to give myself possibilities of advancing to f4. Now, a new feature enters the game. Although black has the queenside pawn majority, rook b1 is a popular plan by white. He intends to attack black's queenside structure with pawn to b4. And here I played a good move, which I did know about before, which is to play pawn up to a5. Now this looks like an ugly move, because now there's no way that I'll ever be able to play pawn to b5, and of course you could well say that I've given away that square to the white knight. However, there's things to be doing on the king side, and that's going to keep me adequately busy. After a5, rook fe1, bishop d7, you'll see what I mean. Keith played e3 and he's slightly at a loss at what to do. Knight f6, so I've retreated my knight, of course, with the pawn having got to f5 already. Rook b to d1, rook c8, possibly with the intention of advancing my pawn up to c4, knight e2, and now my knight came into e4. An excellent square, of course. It's very, very difficult for white to budge this by moving his pawn up to f3, because then the e3 pawn will be a real target. Keith opposed the bishops with bishop to c3, but I quite liked keeping my Benoni bishop, and so chose to take it with the knight. Knight takes c3, and after b takes c3, I played b5, so hopefully making my extra queenside pawn count. A takes b5, bishop takes b5, knight f4, I played queen f6. Black has a definite advantage here because he has an outside pass pawn and 2 wicked bishops. So actually, although I'm very satisfied with that previous line, I want to show you this game where Jim chose queen e7. White rook came to e1. Black played knight g4. A very useful manoeuvre to remember. The black knight is aiming for e5. h3, knight e5, and pawn up to a5. I want to have a few words about this because this is a critical point. When I was a junior and faced the Benoni as white, I always used to think that this pawn move here was a good one because, of course, it appears to fix black's queenside pawns. Of course, if ever the b pawn moves, it can be captured en passant. However, I now know that it's not always the answer to white's problems. For starters, this pawn can become weak in itself. Although in an endgame it can be useful to fix this pawn, in a middle game The answer is that, in fact, black is happy to open up the file for his rook. From b6 or b8, of course, it pressurises the b2 pawn and could even enter the kingside via b4. Jim played bishop f5, attacking the queen. We're also going to see later why playing e4 can be a drawback for white. For starters, it gives away the d3 square, and this can be particularly useful if black should advance a pawn to c4 and flick a knight in there. Instead, the cautious Keith Arkle played queen to b3, and Jim responded with rook to b8. Seeking a home, the white knight ventured from c3 over to a4. However, this concedes the b5 square, and Jim decided to relocate his bishop over to the queen side. The knight hopped into b6, but as you'll see, the knight never really does anything on this square. Jim played bishop over to b5, rook a b1, pawn up to g5, an aggressive move, budging the bishop from f4. The bishop retreated to d2, and the f-pawn joined it. An important move. The f5 square was a weakness in itself, but of course with a pawn there, it's merely controlling the centre of the board. A definite strong point for black. The queen retreated to c2, attacking f5, which is defended by the black queen. Queen f6. Now white got this move, pawn to b4 played. Now, usually this is a good move for white, because if black is forced to play pawn to c4, something he often doesn't want to do, it relinquishes control of the d4 square, from where a knight could hop to either e6 or sometimes c6 if black's already moved his pawn up to b5. Of course here it's not so relevant because there's no white knight ready to come into d4. Rook bc1 and pawn up to f4. We've seen how this can be such a strong move already. Pawn f4 and the bishop came to c3, temporarily at least pinning the black knight on e5. Black now posed white some problems along the f file. F takes g3, f takes g3, and rook f8. Rook f1, and in a second you're going to see why I was so keen to show you this game. The black queen retreated to e7. The white bishop came into e4, directing its attentions to h7. Now, look at this for a move. In this apparently, well, normal position, not much happening, it seems. I quite like black because he has this excellent knight on e5, but Jim played knight d3. Typical Plaskett play. The end of the game seems fairly conclusive. White traded on f8, rook takes f8, rook takes f8, and of course he has to take, there's no choice, he must take the troublesome intruder. E takes d3, c takes d3, and the point is that this pawn cannot be captured by the bishop on e4 because of a queen check on the e3 square. However, the bishop on e4 is en prise, so the white queen swung over to g2 to protect it. The bishop traded on c3, rook recapturing, and now giving white something else to worry about. Black advanced the pawn up to d2. Another queen is on the cards. Well, there's only one move. White must take this pawn. But now the bishop on e4 is en prise. Rook f1 check, king h2, and queen takes e4. Jim has this all carefully worked out. There's only a few checks. Queen takes g5 check, king h8, rook c8 check, bishop e8. And with checkmates threatened on h1, there's just nothing doing for white. In fact, he attempted rook takes, bishop check, queen takes, queen d2. But after queen e4, queen c3 check, king g8, queen c8 check, king g7, queen c7 check, king g6, queen takes d6 check, rook f6. The end was nigh. Queen c5 at least covering f2, but queen e2 check, king g1, and of course it's fitting that the last move would be checkmate. Returning to another critical situation, because of this knight g4 to e5 manoeuvre which often crops up. A critical move for white here is pawn up to h3. An old game featuring a very interesting idea is the game, a very short one, Saeed Norwood from the Lloyds Bank Masters in 1984. David Norwood, an expert in the Benoni, played rook b8 and after knight c4 did indeed challenge the knight on c4 with knight e5, the usual plan. The white knight sidestepped back to a3 and a very strange looking move, bishop to d7. Now it's not strange in that obviously black is preparing pawn to b5, but what about this knight on e5? An excellent square, but what was he to do after pawn to f4? Well, we had our answer. He left the knight en prise in the centre of the board and flicked the other knight over to h5, attacking this weak g3 pawn. White took the knight on e5, f takes e5, black recaptured bishop takes e5, and the pawn advanced to g4. Natural enough. So white has won a whole piece for a pawn, although his king is looking a little bit full of holes. The black knight made it into g3, attacking the rook on f1, but naturally enough white thought, well, I can afford to give up the exchange, can't I? Knight to c4. Dave the Rave Norwood, though, wasn't interested in taking a rook. That's small fry. He took on c3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, the idea being to unleash the rook on the e2 pawn. But did he capture this pawn straight away? No, he didn't. What happened next? Bishop takes g4. A stunning move. The point is that after h takes g4, knight takes e2 check, king h2, queen h4 check simply leads to mate. Bishop h3, queen g3 check, king h1, and yes, thank you very much. White didn't take the bishop, but he didn't last much longer either. Queen d3, knight takes e2 check, king h2, and he just simple chess now, knight takes c1. The idea being that if white was to take the knight on c1, he would run into bishop to e2. But it's not as though his selection was any better, really. He played queen c2, bishop e2, rook f4, and the knight came back out. Knight back out to d3, essentially leaving white's position in tatters. Rook e4, rook takes e4, bishop takes e4, and knight f4. White couldn't bear any more, and he threw in the towel. In the fianchetto variation, black always retains this extra handy pawn on c5. White's additional pawn is the e2 pawn, but because that never really gets going, I just don't think this is a challenging variation. Playing for us, with the Benoni, was Grandmaster John Ems against Mr. Henriksen. John chose to play the Nimzo Indian move order. Whether or not you really intend to play the Nimzo, there's a certain bluff element. Either way, White played the knight out to f3, and we reached the Benoni by this very popular move order. John chooses to play d6 instead of swapping on d5, but invariably the same position is reached. E takes d5, c takes d5, g6, and now we have the classical variation, pawn to e4. Now, I'm about to suggest a fairly simple system for black to adopt. First you play a6. Obviously, White doesn't want to allow you to play pawn to b5, so the usual a4 comes in. And now, bishop to g4. If black was just to play knight bd7 before getting the bishop out, of course then it might never see the light of day. Hence, black is quite keen to trade off this bishop for the knight on f3. A very important square in the Benoni is the e5 square, and this guarantees him more control in that position. After bishop e2, black trades on f3 with no provocation. The knight comes to d7, and we see controlling nicely the e5 square. White castled, and now black can happily continue with his development. Bishop to g7. The white bishop came out to f4, attacking the d6 pawn, but we nicely see the black queen slide to e7. Here, of course, it defends the d6 pawn, exerts pressure on the e4 pawn. Of course, black's not going to be looking to take that just yet, and more importantly, guards the e5 square. Rook e1 is an obvious enough move. Black castled, and the white queen came up to d2, connecting the rooks. Black rook f to e8, and the white pawn came up to a5. We've discussed this before. Black has been stopped from getting the nice pawns that he might like with the pawn up to b5. Of course, this is an excellent situation for him, controlling all of these squares here, a4 through to d4. However, the a5 pawn could always be a target. Now, a very interesting idea from black. Pawn to h5. No, he's not looking to get an early queen. The point is that black is supporting the idea of a knight g4 to e5 manoeuvre, and also making available the retreat knight h7. You'll see why this is useful a little later. White played pawn up to h3, and this is why this game is so good. We see lots of interesting ideas coming to fruition. Here black plays rook a c8, and another element is introduced. Black has an intention of playing pawn up to c4 and swinging the knight from d7 over to c5, from where it can launch and go to either b3 or d3. White prevented this with pawn to b3, such that c4 then would be met by b4 and the knight would never find its way into c5. Instead, though, John returned to plan A, knight h7. White vacated his rook from the long diagonal, unpinning the knight with rook a to c1, and the black bishop dropped in, paid a visit to the d4 square. We've already seen from here how it can pressurise this f2 pawn. Well, white wasn't very happy about that at all and retreated his bishop to budge this one away, and it just came back to f6. This is all part of the knight h7 plan. White showing a certain lack of ambition, retreated the bishop to f4, and John played, well, a very sensible move. He played his knight from h7 to g5. Quite frankly, I think bishop g5 would also have been good. John selected to keep the pieces on, showing definite aggressive intent. Knight to g5, attacking the bishop on f3. Of course, white has to be careful about just moving this bishop, because the e4 pawn is certainly looking loose. Instead, then, he defended it with the queen. Queen to e2. And now the other knight made its way to e5. So, at the moment, unless white concedes this bishop on f4, he's going to end up with shattered pawns. Thus, white bailed out with bishop takes e5. Bishop takes e5, leaving us with an opposite coloured bishop situation. However, let's look at the relative roles of these bishops. The white one on f3 has absolutely no scope, hemmed in by its own pawns on e4 and d5. The only chance it could ever have would be if this white pawn on f2 could launch itself to f4 at some point. On the other hand, the e5 bishop looks out in both directions, and black has a simple plan of queen to f6 up to f4. This has been a very straightforward game by black so far, and it's almost fitting that white falls into a little tactic here. He retreats the knight to d1. It's a nice idea to want to relocate the knight to c4. We've seen how it can be well placed there, but out of the blue came knight takes h3 check. Oops. The knight must be taken surely, because otherwise it's coming back to f4, and then the black queen would come into h4, getting well in on the action. However, of course, after g takes h3, the fork queen g5 check appeared. King f1 and queen takes c1. Well, one desperate last move, knight e3, but after queen b2, he was just lots of material down and promptly resigned. Now, I guess you're wondering where this position has sprung from. Well, the beauty of the Benoni is that even when things may look as though they're going wrong, there's always a chance. This position cropped up from another one of John M's games, this time against James Poulton from London, 1993. Here, white has a pawn on e6, which looks extremely restricting, and black's got a knight stuck in the corner of the board. Remarkably, though, there was a massive turnaround within a few moves. Black played queen f6. His intention was to play queen h4, and of course, given the chance, queen takes h2 checkmate. White attempted to budge this knight from g4. It was causing all sorts of problems, in particular controlling the f2 and the e3 squares. In fact, though, the knight doesn't have to move. Black played queen h4, and now we see why this Benoni bishop is such a monster in the centre of the board, completely cutting off the white king on h1. The threat is knight to f2 check. White stopped this with rook f1, but after queen g3, he found himself in a hopeless situation. He resigned. There would only be one move, h takes g4, but then simply queen h4 mate. Returning to an earlier stage of this classical variation, it seems that the bishop g4 takes f3 plan is extremely respectable. Hence, white has been turning to a crafty move, pawn to h3. The idea is if black simply plays bishop g7, then white can play e4 with no danger of losing his f3 knight. I believe there's a cunning ploy to intercept white's plan here. Instead of simply playing bishop to g7, I like the move pawn up to a6. As usual, white will play a4, and now queen e7. The point is simple. There is no e4 available to white. While I'm on it though, if we throw back the moves pawn back to a2 and black pawn back to a7, this would be possible because of a crafty queen check on a4. That one's worth remembering. As white can't play pawn to e4, he'll have to settle for moving to e3, probably getting the bishop outside of the chain first, bishop to g5. Now, another clever little idea, a nice finesse. The knight from b8 comes to d7. We're leaving the bishop on f8 for the time being. White pawn up to e3. Now, h6, bishop h4, and the black knight springs out to e5. If white sidesteps with knight d2, then black can simply play bishop to f5. The idea is he's controlling the d3 square, the bishop's made it to quite a nice diagonal, and then soon to follow will be bishop g7 and of course castles. If black feels adventurous, there is always the option to go pawn up to g5, and that would give this bishop a natural retreat square on g6. Different plans suggest themselves other than an infiltration on d3 immediately. There's always the rook c8 and pawn to c4 plan, as well as simply aiming to expand with b5. It's certainly my opinion that if black can get in bishop g4 and bishop takes f3, then he has absolutely no problems. In the next sections, of course, we'll be looking at lines when white prevents black from doing that, and I believe those lines are more of a test. Avoiding the pin but preparing e4 sees knight d2. This is, of course, chunk number 4, if you've been following closely. For this section, I'd like to show another one of my games. Simple development, bishop to g7 and pawn up to e4. I castled. These are, of course, the usual moves for black to play. And the white bishop came to e2. Now, I've said it several times before, if this white knight is making its way to c4, black must take some steps to remove it when it gets there at some point, because it can cause all sorts of problems. We've seen knight d7 to e5. Here though, the other method, knight a6 first of all. White castles, knight c7. A new placing for the knight in this video, but the idea is that black supports the push pawn to b5 at some stage. White played a4, this move usually comes anyway, and a b6, this is it. The bishop is going to come over to a6 when the white knight comes to c4. White played the bolstering solid f3, making no concessions whatsoever. Not very ambitious though in my view. I played rook to b8. The knight came to c4, inevitable of course, and bishop over to a6. If anything, this light square bishop is the one piece that often doesn't do so much, so usually black's happy to swap it off. My opponent in the 1997 Copenhagen Open was a Mr. Jorgensen. He played rook to b1. This protects the b2 pawn, but of course, possibly we've seen before, white has ambitions for b2 to b4. I captured on c4, bishop takes c4, and after he recaptured, bishop takes c4, I retreated the other knight to d7. We've seen how the knight makes its way to e5 via g4. This time it's coming via d7. What's more, of course, is it vacates the f6 square, so that now black has the option for f5, one of my favourite moves in the Benoni. Black's got several opportunities now. Sure, he may well be threatening to capture the pawn on e4, but of course, I'm sure he gets a very good King's Indian style position by playing f4. This is the structure that black often gets in a King's Indian, only in such situations, often, there's a pawn on e5. Here, not only could the knight use that square, but the bishop is unobstructed and can pressurise white's queenside as well as move to d4. White felt he had no option but to capture on f5, and I took back with the rook. Of course, the e6 square can be a problem, but at the moment it's well covered by the knight, and more importantly, it doesn't look as though it's going to be invaded by any of the enemy pieces. However, this d5 pawn, although I'm not looking to take it just yet, it's certainly weak for the future. White played g4, hitting the rook, and I retreated to f8. And now white played the pawn up to f4. White's king position is looking a little loose here, but of course at least he has the advantage of taking away the e5 square from my knight. Now I sought a bit of action on the queen side, pawn up to a6. White got his move in b4, but b5 came now because of extra protection here. The knight on c7, the pawn on a6, and of course the rook on b8. We had a trade of pawns on b5. A takes b5, A takes b5, and the bishop retreated to e2. I felt happy to play pawn to c4 because I felt there was no chance of a white knight emerging on d4 and then on c6. White played g5, and I connected my rooks, queen up to e7. Has to be said that probably white struggled a bit for a plan now, but his position's fairly uncomfortable already. White played rook to c1, and my knight swung over to b6, and that's right, I'm pressurising this d5 pawn. Particularly with my pawn already on c4, there's not much chance of my king being caught out along the a2 to g8 diagonal when I mop up this pawn on d5. White played bishop to g4, but of course I'm taking it. That pawn is mine. Knight b takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5. The white queen came out to f3, queen a7 check, king h1, and having mopped up the pawn, I retreat back to e7. We can see now that I have two excellent connected passed pawns down the centre of the board, and what's more, white's extra pawn is a target, it's not even a strength. I'm blockading nicely the f5 square. White played bishop e3, and although I won't win any Entertainment of the Year awards, I simply played queen a8, rook fd1, knight f5, bishop f2, but just to be efficient I traded the queens. Queen takes f3 check. White has got the bishop pair, but he's got no effective majority. Meanwhile, these space invaders will roll down the board. White is fighting a lost cause, and indeed I won the game in 49 moves. The whole concept of knight d2 is quite nice. It certainly has appealing aspects. However, it's very time consuming, and the important thing is that when a white knight finally makes it to c4, a super square, black always has the ability to chop it off. Trading pieces helps black, and so long as he can keep control of the e5 square, he has no problems. Here in section 5, I'd like to introduce a slightly different approach by white. e4, g6, and now not moving the f-pawn yet, and no, not even bringing the knight out to f3. Instead, bishop d3, bishop g7, and knight g e2. Castles, castles, a6, a4, knight bd7. After h3, we now find ourselves following a game Pavlovich against Kovacevic from Bremen, 1998. In this recent encounter, we see a solid old idea reintroduced. I've mentioned before the problems that black can experience with this c8 bishop. So immediately he seeks action on the queen side. The queen comes to c7. The intention is to push this pawn from c5 up to c4 in order to allow the d7 knight into the game. White played f4. This is the advantage of not having committed the knight to f3, and black plays a natural rook e8, pressurising e4 but keeping a firm grip over the e5 square. One point I would like to make now is that black must always keep an eye out for an old idea that white has involving sacrificing a pawn with pawn to e5, d takes e5, and then pawn up to f5. Not especially frightening here, it's just something worth bearing in mind. White parked the knight on g3, the usual square for this system, and black played c4, so immediately expanding on the queen side. Bishop retreated to c2, and the black rook came to b8. So it's fairly clear what black has in mind. Bishop e3, and this knight hopped into c5. So e4 is pressurised, and of course there's potentials for d3 and b3 for the knight. White's bishop is actually usually quite well placed on c2 because at least it covers both of those possibilities. White played the bishop to d4, but black has a straightforward plan. b5. This is where he has his extra pawn, so why not push it? A takes b5, A takes b5. In many encounters now, I've seen the continuation pawn up to f5. This time round it's white that has aggressive intentions. However, the e4 pawn, which is the extra pawn that white has, is not doing an awful lot, and this move pawn up to f5 relinquishes control of the e5 square. g5 is a good move in this position. Of course, if white's pieces manage to get at the black king, he could be in trouble, but he's counting on immediate play on the queen side. In this game, white played the precautionary king h1, vacating his king from the g1 to a7 diagonal. However, this doesn't prevent black from continuing with his plan. Pawn up to b4, and it looks as though the e4 pawn is lost. I've mentioned before that this has been seen on several occasions, but it would appear that the following sacrifice is unsound for white. Knight to h5. Rather than just losing a pawn for nothing, white goes for broke. Knight takes h5. Queen takes h5. Bishop takes d4. White was definitely hoping to maybe play f6 or e5 with checkmating possibilities on h7 and g7. However, it doesn't turn out that way. White does try f6, but having won a piece already, black can simply return the material. Bishop takes f6. Rook takes f6. And now maybe black could grab the knight on c3 in this position, but instead the cautious rook e5 was played. Of course, the queen on c7, so good at helping advance this c pawn in the first place, is also defending f7. White doubled up the rooks, fair enough. In fact, it's looking quite dangerous here on f7. However, now a nifty little move to distract the white queen. Pawn up to g4. This pawn is defended by the bishop on c8, the one I said which never does anything. And meanwhile, the black rook on e5 is attacking the queen. After the queen retreats, of course, it's been deflected from this attacking task on f7, and so black was able to capture the knight on c3. Well, white saw no better, and in fact there is no better than cashing in his chips. Rook takes f7. Queen takes f7, rook takes f7, king takes f7, and queen takes h7 check. However, although he's bagged the black queen, there's plenty of other pieces left in black's armament. The king retreated to e8, and what's more, there's no chance of a perpetual check. Queen g8 check, king d7, queen takes g4 check, king c7. The black king has been smuggled away into safety, and the white pawns on g2 and h3 aren't going to be very relevant once black's pieces come into play. In fact, a disaster occurred and white played bishop d1. Thank you very much. Bishop takes queen, and of course white resigned instantly. A blunder that ruined an otherwise excellent game. Knight g2 looks snazzy, but frankly lacks punch. Where it's at for white is in the centre of the board. f4, e5. I'm afraid the knight on e2 just doesn't offer the support that it would do on the f3 square. There's no reason whatsoever for black to fear this variation. Now in section 6, this is where things get a little bit more scary. e4, g6, and no beating about the bush, white plays the aggressive f4. This section is dedicated to the 4 pawns attack. Bishop g7, knight f3, castles by black, and bishop e2. Most often though, the 4 pawns attack comes about via a King's Indian defence move order, as indeed in our featured game Kalusek Toth from Budapest 1998. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, and here's where you can see it's 4 pawns, f4, so there's 4 pawns there at the moment. Black castles, white knight out f3, and finally black strikes out in the centre, c5, d5, e6, white bishop to e2, e takes d5, c takes d5, and voila, here we are at our typical 4 pawns attack Benoni variation. Here, the usual moves are either rook e8 or bishop g4. However, for this video, I'd like to introduce a lesser known move and see how it takes your fancy. Knight b d7. Now, the standard way for white to treat the 4 pawns attack is to splatter black down the centre of the board, and this was the move played in this game. E5, attacking the knight on f6. Basically, castles is the only alternative, but then, with rook e8, black has knocked this e5 plan on the head. Knight d2 would be a typical response. We've seen this so many times now with the knight coming to c4, but now a new idea. Pawn up to c4, sacrificing this c4 pawn, bishop takes c4, in order to allow the knight to come in to c5. Of course, the e4 pawn is now a target, and if white were to try and protect that, rook e1, black could play knight up to g4. Now it will be too late for a white steamroller. Pawn up to e5 because black has got knight d3, a stunning sacrifice. Attacking the rook on e1, but vacating the g1 to a7 diagonal. Let's see what might happen. Bishop takes d3, queen b6 check, and I'm sure you can see it coming. Not king f1 because of queen f2 mate, but king h1, knight f2 check, king g1. Do we want the queen? No thank you. Knight h3 check, king h1, queen g1 check, rook takes g1, and knight f2 smothered mate. So, back to the standard taking no prisoners approach by white. e5, a very bold move, bearing in mind the white king is still in the centre. D takes e5, f takes e5, knight g4. White has two very strong looking pawns in the centre of the board here, but the e5 pawn is just about to drop off, hence pawn up to e6. The knight from d7 swings into e5, e takes f7 check, rook takes f7, castles, knight takes f3 check, bishop takes f3. Black's position is most satisfactory. The d5 pawn is not a big problem, and besides, there are some tactical reasons why white is in big trouble. Bishop d4 check. How many times have we seen this bishop do so much from this square? King h1, and not even the greedy knight f2 check, but rather knight takes h2. This knight cannot be taken, of course. King takes h2, queen h4 checkmate. On the other hand, queen h4 is coming in anyway. White tried knight e4, but knight takes f3, rook takes f3, queen h4 check, meant at the very least the loss of the white knight. Horrible game, white resigned. I think it's clear that life could be a bit more tricky for black with this white pawn on f4. However, if white just continues with knight f3 and castles bishop e2, as in this 4 pawns attack, it seems as though black can develop his pieces nicely and safely. With plans available like c4 and knight c5, combined with rook e8 and e4, it shows that white himself can soon be on the defensive. In my opinion, by far the most threatening variation to the modern Benoni player is the so-called flick knife attack. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the tape now, and I won't have time to go into that. Just kidding. In fact, we have got time, and boy is it a revelation. Instead of the natural knight f3, which, as we've seen, is a typical 4 pawns attack and gives black a chance to castle, we see the discombobulating bishop to b5 check. This upsets black's development somewhat, because ideally he would like to play either bishop d7 or knight b d7. However, both of those fall foul of e5. Not entirely clear-cut, but I suspect that black has more of the problems. Recently, I spoke to the amiable, integrated English Grandmaster from Croatia, Bogdan Lalic. I told him that surely the Benoni was refuted by bishop b5 check, the flick knife attack. On the contrary, he argued, in fact, it's winning for black. I suspect the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Knight fd7 is the best practical move, and white probably has to play a4 now in order to guard against an expansion of black's queenside pawns with the typical a6 and b5. The game Lalic Cote Sur must have been what put Bogdan off. In this encounter, black castled. White developed with knight f3, and by virtue of the fact that the knight on b8 can't go to d7, we see the other manoeuvre, knight a6. Sometimes it is possible for this knight to hop into b4, but in this particular game, after white castled, black played knight c7. Here, white chose to preserve the bishop by retreating it to d3. He could equally have gone to either c4 or e2, but the same plans would have been applicable. Black played a6, and Bogdan continued with rook e1. You can see the attraction of this move because white would like to get in the move e4 to e5. On the other hand, it's also true that the white rook was well placed on f1. Black played the obvious and sensible rook to e8, after which white played bishop e3, completing his development. My criticism of white's play was that he remains a bit planless in this game. And is it really completing his development by moving the bishop to e3, or is it just moving a piece? Although it's certainly not clear what white should do, black has more obvious plans. Rook b8, with the obvious intention of following up with pawn to b5. That explains why Bogdan played a5. And the good old debate occurs. Pawn to b5, a takes b6, a rook takes b6. Black hasn't got the strong queenside pawns that he often gets when he winds up with a pawn on b5. On the other hand, he does have a very active rook. White defended the b2 pawn with queen d2, and immediately black slung the rook down to b4. An excellent square for a black rook, pressurising both b2 and e4. White added extra support to the b2 pawn with rook a b1, but now the black knight came back to f6, unleashing the bishop on c8 and also preparing to move the knight to g4. We have seen in the past how important this Benoni bishop can be. In order to neutralise it, invariably white will need the equivalent bishop. If black can gain the bishop on e3, the dark square bishop, for his knight, then he's always doing well. If white were to prevent this knight g4 move here with h3, then black has at his disposal an excellent exchange sacrifice. He can capture the pawn on e4. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, rook takes e4, bishop takes e4, and rook takes e4. Black would be the exchange for a pawn down, but he would have two raking, excellent bishops, and the pawn on d5 will be destined to drop. So Bogdan tried to preserve the bishop by retreating it to f2. Then, though, he ran into bishop g4, which heralds the threat of capturing the knight and wrecking the white pawn structure around the king. At a slight loss of what to do, Bogdan played knight to g5. The intention, presumably, was to at least provoke the slight weakening of Black's own king position. Black did play h6, attacking the knight, which simply retreated to f3. It's true that this subtle manoeuvre by White doesn't seem to have achieved anything. On the other hand, it was very difficult for him to find an improvement, bearing in mind the white bishop on d3 was required there in order to support the e4 pawn. Black captured on f3, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and now we can see an obvious target is the white pawn on f4. Indeed, Black immediately set about attacking it with knight over to h5. Standard treatment. This also enables the black queen to enter the action. Well, somewhat annoyed that this black rook was so flexible on b4, White tried to budge it away, knight a2. He doesn't like this rook along the black 5th rank, but the shock came with rook d4. White's dark square bishop is such an important piece that Black is prepared to sacrifice the exchange in order to win it. Of course, at this precise moment, the white bishop on d3 is pinned to the queen. Therefore, the queen is overworked because it's having to defend both f4 and d3. Thus, White decided there was no option but to capture the rook. Bishop takes d4. Bishop takes d4 check. King h1. And the black queen zapped into h4. At the moment then, Black is attacking the f4 pawn and has possibilities of knight into g3 check. Bogdan played bishop to c4. And Black simply captured on f4 with the knight. Of course, Black certainly wants to keep the queens on the board because he has checkmate in mind. Desperate now to cover his king position, White decided that he would be prepared to offer the exchange back. But Black wasn't interested. He's not interested in capturing that rook on g1, certainly not with this bishop, which is such a powerful piece. Instead, Black came on in with knight h3, attacking the rook on g1, again, this time with the knight. Rook g3 now would have fallen foul of knight f2 check, king g2, and knight takes e4, because after f takes e4, queen takes e4 check, we see that the b1 rook is hanging. This is a good indication of just how uncoordinated White's army is. Instead then, White had to make do with rook g2. After knight f2 check, rook takes f2, Black recaptured with the bishop. He may well have won a pawn. After all those exploits, he now finds himself a clear pawn up, no longer the exchange down, but he's still playing for the attack. The white knight tried to make its way back into the game, knight to c3, but now look at this. Extra reinforcement, rook up to e5. The white rook moved from b1 over to f1 to offer some sort of protection, hustling perhaps that dark squared bishop, but bishop came back out to g3, rook g1 and bishop f4. What a lovely square for that bishop. Attacking the queen and of course keeping the eye out on the h2 pawn. The white queen sidestepped to e2 and a fairly predictable move, rook h5, threatening checkmate, starting with queen takes h2. White had to play rook g2 to offer a little bit of support, but certainly the white king is beginning to look a little bit suffocated. The queen dropped back to f6, possibly preparing to drop into the centre of the board on d4. Knight d1. There's pressure little for white to do, in fact. He's certainly struggling. Okay, we see a superb bishop, we see an active rook, the queen's doing all sorts of things. What's left to get involved? Oh yes, the black knight. Knight b5. Look at that, the d4 square. Wowee, what a square for the knight. Can't be allowed, there's no chance for that to happen. Bishop takes b5, a takes b5. And knight to f2. The white queen couldn't be allowed to capture this pawn on b5. It's simply required for defensive duties. In we come. The queens love it in the centre of the board. The queen dominates from this square here. Queen d4, a totally flexible move. Knight d3. Bishop e3. And now, well, white, desperate to get some sort of dark square control here, plays the pawn up to f4, hoping desperately that black can't capture this pawn on e4, which of course he does, because after all, the two queens are in direct opposition. The bishop on e3 can't move away, can it, because it's pinned? Not, I'm afraid, the case. After knight f2, a dramatic conclusion to the game. A rook takes h2 check, and it's curtains. Of course the king can't go to g1 because this rook on g2 will be taken with checkmate. The rook is pinned on g2, so it can't capture on h2, leaving just one option. King takes h2, but now bishop takes f4 check, and black wins the queen. No choice, white resigns. Actually, I think it's a nice touch that our final position includes these lovely pawns on the queen side, a complete feature of the modern Benoni. What's more is this bishop has worked wonders, the Benoni bishop dominating the board. Bolton Lalich was 2600 when this game was played. If a super grandmaster can lose playing the so-called fantastic flick knife variation, then we can hardly call it a refutation. Sure, I play this line with white, but already the seeds of doubt have been planted in my mind. Mainline Queen's Pawn players have a solid reputation. With the modern Benoni, I believe you have an opening that can throw your opponent off balance. It's not a dubious gambit whereby I'll be saying, buy the book, buy the video, buy the CD, but don't play it against anyone above ELO 1800. I provided you with an exciting repertoire which is quite sound. I'm finished now, but may the force be with you.